to our shame.
Mm.
When I say we, I'm talking collectively. The political class really hasn't argued for this COVID zero strategy.
Right.
And that is the thing that would keep many people safe. But of course, you know, people are chasing the economics, and the economics really are about the economics for the few in the end, because workers in Leicester have been continuing to work, but they're not getting any richer.
No. Right. I think we've actually gone live.
Have we?
We have. We better get on. Right.
Okay.
Okie dokie. Welcome, folks, to Left Media TV here on @Socialist Telly. My name is Damien Willey, better known as Cornish Damo, and I'll be here on a regular Sunday night slot in conversation with a special guest for some politics talk and some general chat. The powers that be have officially given me my own show. This week, I have the pleasure of being joined by former NEC member, Islington councillor, former policy advisor to the London Mayor's office, and now member of Parliament for her home turf up in Leicester East, Claudia Webbe. Claudia, welcome to my show. How are you?
I'm fine. It's good to be with you. And on this new medium, this new form, it's really pretty good. This alternative medium, really great, really good to be with you. And I'm obviously speaking to you, here from Leicester, so that's pretty good. And I'm really proud to be able to represent my home city, and that's a fantastic. It's fantastic, really, to be, you know, having been born here, having grown up here, having experienced my early political life here, having understood a whole great deal about what makes me tick today. All of that happened from Leicester.
Yeah, sure. Yes, as you said, born and raised in Leicester, of course, went to university there, and now you're representing your home essentially as an MP. Sorry.
Well, I was going to just say, my university days in Leicester actually it was actually my second degree course. I did Leicester De Montfort University as an adult, as a young adult.
Right.
And my first degree was actually in Coventry. I didn't go too far from home. I'm hearing fireworks this end. I didn't go too far from home. I went to Coventry to do my first degree in mathematics, statistics, and computers, of all things to do. But yeah, that's where I had my first degree.
No, nothing wrong with that. I did my first degree as an adult with that wonderful socialist institution that is the Open University. I decided to do physics. So, you know, if you thought maths and statistics might be an odd choice, yeah, I can kind of relate to that. Now, this, of course, is your second appearance here on @Socialist Telly. So thank you for once again taking time out of your no doubt busy schedule to come speak to us, to support alternative left-wing media, as you've already said. And in case people haven't seen it yet, and it is, of course, still available to watch on Socialist Telly accounts, you were engaged in a discussion earlier in the week on the twindemic, as it was titled, the twin pandemics of both COVID and structural racism, with some excellent fellow panelists. You were on with Tahira Mirza, Howard Beckett, Bonnie Craven, Professor Kailash Chand, and Shabir Laka. Brilliant lineup, eminently qualified to talk about the subject matter at hand. I just wanted to bring this conversation back to your work and responsibilities as an MP. So how has the COVID pandemic affected your constituency, in particular, in your constituency work? And what has the impact been of government handling of this crisis there? And given that the pandemic has been tied to structural racism on the part of the government in your previous appearance, what has the impact been from that perspective as well?
Yeah, I mean, it has been incredibly problematic, the whole government handling of coronavirus, because it's never been felt more so than in my home city of Leicester, because we have been here in Leicester in perpetual lockdown or special measures ever since the first national lockdown, because of the government's poor handling, in my view, of the COVID-19 response, and in what that means, so that people can really fully understand it. It means, imagine actually not being able to visit another person's household, actually go inside that person's other household since the first national lockdown. That's essentially what it's been. Been about. And so whether it's been a Leicester lockdown, or whether it's been additional special measures, or whether it's been now in our second lockdown, and many people will be speaking of a third lockdown, but Leicester has learned that obviously coming out of the national lockdown on December the 2nd, it will enter into tier 3, so the most high risk scenario. So it will be it's been quite significant. Yet we are in the city where we feed the country and clothe the world. So it would seem, both in terms of our food processing factories and our garment factories. And obviously Leicester East has its fair share, certainly, of garment factories, and indeed many workers in Leicester East work in those food processing factories and those garment industries. So what has been happening is that there is no such thing for Leicester people of working from home, or Leicester East constituents of working from home, because they've been required to work and required to continue to go to those factories and those places to keep the nation fed and to keep the nation clothed. And that has had, I believe, a detrimental impact, because those workers are going out to work. And of course, the coronavirus has done a lot of things. It's shone a light on many aspects of inequalities that have existed for some time. And no more has it shone a light than on the levels of severe inequalities that exist in Leicester East and Leicester per se, in terms of workers and what workers have had to put up with, because they certainly aren't getting any richer. They're working harder and longer, and they're being paid poverty pay, much less than even half the minimum wage. So it's shone that light in a very severe way, and those kind of inequalities. And the other inequality that it's shone a very clear light, of course, as well as there's class inequalities, is of course the race inequalities, which affects us all nationally, of course, in terms of the inequalities that have occurred. Because when Leicester went into a Leicester lockdown, and when Leicester was the only city to go into its own lockdown, of course, the media and everybody else wanted to somehow define this as something to do with ethnicity and culture, and it had nothing to do with that. And the government was shameful in not calling out their own inadequacies, their own failings, from locking down far too late, from care home neglect, from their debacle in terms of test, trace and track, and the privatization of that system, and having little due regard to people's lives, really. It was the government and its handling of coronavirus that caused the Leicester lockdown and the continuous lockdown, not workers, not minority ethnic communities. And it's shameful that the media had to be called out on this. And I say that because every media showing at that time, when it looked at Leicester, there wasn't far a female wearing a hijab in those images, and that presented an image and a portrayal of Leicester and racism, which was unacceptable. So you had the collaboration of the media alongside government, politics, basically blaming the working class and minority ethnic communities, or giving an impression that the blame rests with minority ethnic communities. And it took a long time to kind of like break that and get people to understand that this isn't about ethnic minorities. This is very much about government and its handling.
Well, we'll certainly come on to a question about the media presently. But as you say, there was a narrative that was carried through the media quite a lot, where it was a lot of emphasis was put on ethnic minorities perhaps being somehow more susceptible to the virus, and therefore they may be more greater spreaders of it, for lack of another way of putting it. But simply there was no scientific basis for either. And I think
Well, look, I don't want to mix. Don't want to mix this up. I want to be absolutely clear. The statistics are real in the sense that if the statistics that came out that said that when we saw that for ourselves, the disproportionate impact of coronavirus on African, Asian, minority ethnic communities was severe. We saw that in terms of the high levels of doctors, nurses, that were left dead following catching the virus, and we saw that in terms of communities, frontline workers, disproportionate amongst which were African, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. So the statistics were clear about that, and of course, we now have even more clear statistics that say that actually, not only is it disproportionate in terms of the numbers of deaths, but it is disproportionate in terms of the numbers who catch the virus as well. But this is all about the socioeconomic realities of life. You know, that this is about being located in the densest housing, multi-occupational housing, multi-generational housing, and being working on the front lines, you know, keeping the country going. And that's what it's about. And the failure of government to protect communities is basically throws water on the government's pledge, or Boris Johnson's own pledge, to extend government's arms around every single worker. That is clearly not what has happened, because obviously for thousands of workers, those warm words must leave a very bitter taste, because clearly for many people across the country who have had to continue to work, have not had the luxury of working from home, and have not had the benefits of any increase in pay either for doing so. And it's an ideological choice that the government makes to not protect the working class. It's an ideological choice that the government makes to not protect African, Caribbean, and Asian communities, and therefore they are complicit in their deaths, and they're complicit in people catching this virus, because those who are clearly able to stay safe are able to do so, but the government is clearly not willing to keep everybody safe, and those who are sacrificed are the ones who are most vulnerable, and this government has failed to protect everyone. And when you've got, for example, people on no recourse to public funds, and the government refuses to at least end that condition, at least for the duration of the virus, you know that that's an ideological choice. And they know when they make that ideological choice that they leave people vulnerable. They know that it's that people who are faced with no recourse to public funds are people who are more likely to catch the virus, are people who are more likely to die from the virus. So you tell me what else that is, if it isn't their preparedness, just like their preparedness over older people, their preparedness to allow those people to catch the virus and to potentially die from catching it too.
No, I quite agree. I quite agree with that sentiment. It is a conscious choice. It's not as if the money is not there. But I'm going to come on to something similar to that in a little while. But I want to go back into your past a little bit. Before you entered the public eye, I guess it's fair to say, you were involved with something called Operation Trident, nothing to do with nuclear deterrent, for people who hadn't heard of it, but it was a community-led initiative to tackle gun violence in Black communities, which was started after the murders of Avril Johnson and Michelle Carby, who were gunned down in their homes in 1998. And you were actually the chair of the independent advisory group to Trident. You led media campaigns, but increasingly the police became more of a presence following the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, I believe, and later effectively taking over. Now, you spoke out against this police intervention and takeover, and in the intervening years, of course, we've seen much in the news regarding things such as stop and search and ongoing gang violence. So how would you describe the work you did there and the influence you had there? How would you have liked that work to develop?
Well, look, I came into the arena of as you said, Operation Trident. Then that I set up with a number of others in partnership with a number of others across London. Because we'd had enough. We were, of course, challenging the police in our different spheres. I was running something called the Westminster Race Equality Council at that time. And, you know, independent think tank where I was challenging the police left, right and centre as to their treatment of Black communities, from stop and search to, you know, to all manner of things. And essentially, at the same time, however, Black men were dying on our streets and nothing was said. Over 90% of gun-related murders happening on the streets of London at any one particular year, at that time in the mid-1990s, were of Black men, and there was never anybody caught. There was never anybody, you know, arrested even for these incidents, and it was as though Black lives really didn't matter at that time, and therefore we had enough. You know, we said enough was enough. We'll come together. We try and address this problem. And what we found at that time was that the police response to the disproportionate effects of gun crime on Black communities at that time was actually to use what they called criminal informants, and they were able to use a piece of guidance set out by the Home Office at the time, which allowed them to bring what they called criminal informants, essentially people from overseas that they accommodated, housed, put up, and in return for this new life in the UK from abroad, these individuals would act as informants and be classified as bona fide informants. And in fact, the police were found to have misused their powers and misinterpreted the guidance that was set out by the Home Office at that time. And it all came to light in the case of a person called Delroy Denton, who in the 1990s was widely, you know, he'd been brought over from abroad, and he was given this new lifestyle, but in return provide information about men of violence, you know, in terms of guns and crack cocaine, and he was allowed to get away with what was known then as petty crimes. And believe it or not, well, you can imagine, you probably do believe it, in the mid-1990s, domestic violence was seen as a petty crime that they were, you know, allowed to get away with. So it came to light, of course, and you mentioned the case, well, you go on later to talk about Avril Johnson and Michelle Carby, but actually there was a woman called Marcia Laws, and Delroy Denton basically, as he became bolder and bolder with his actions of being able to give information to the police, get away with other things. So to the extent that you could basically run an estate because the police weren't going to touch you, and that's what he was doing. And at the same time, what he was doing was domestic violence. Marcia Laws, sorry, died at the hands of Delroy Denton because he slashed her throat several times in a fit of domestic violence. And that's when the whole thing about the police use of criminal informants came to light. And it was then we had to say, you know, this is enough is enough. It's outrageous the way that the police were building better relationships with people abroad than their own Black communities here in the UK. And that's where things had to change. And the first, and you rightly highlight the case of Avril Johnson and Michelle Carby, because that is the first time that the media paid any attention to this pervasive criminality, because all of that time, and you know, the mid-1990s is when we came together to form Operation Trident, but way back this was happening. You know, 10 years before that, 15 years before that was already happening across the country. But the only media that actually focused on this was what we called back then our alternative media, and that was our Black media, whether that be The Voice or the Caribbean Times as it was known then, or the African Times. It was only those publications that were actually sharing this information. Otherwise, the everyday communities were just simply not even aware, or didn't want to know, or just saw it as a black crime. And certainly the media had every thing going for them to be able to portray it as a black crime. Nothing of the sort. We were talking about disproportionate impact of gun crime on black communities. That is not a black crime. That is simply a disproportionate impact. And what happened then is that the police were labeling things as yardie crime. And so the media was labeling things as yardie crime. And it was all this kind of stereotype about, and it's the wrong kind of stereotype. And so it went from yardie crime to postcode crime, and it was just pure nonsense, actually. The kind of media, and then where it ended is where I said enough was enough. That, you know, well, I didn't say enough was enough. Actually, the police it's literally turfed me out, and my fellow fellow comrades that came together. We'd given our time voluntarily. We'd set something up called the Operation Trident. By the time the Lawrence inquiry came about, that was 5 years after we set up Operation Trident. We couldn't get the police to respond in the mid-1990s. And in fact, you saw that the mangrove was on the TVs the other day. Yeah. Actually, out of that time, and it was the commissioner in charge around the mangrove time. It was the same commissioner that was basically refusing, or the legacy of that was basically refusing any support to treat black people as victims. That was the concept. It's about not seeing black communities as criminals, which is what they were largely doing, and they failed to recognize black communities as victims. And one of the tools that they used to in their failure to recognize is that they were operating on the basis of volume crime. And when you're dealing with volume crime, then you were dealing with burglaries and so on. You weren't recognizing that gun crime, gun-related crime, because they were happening in such few numbers, was actually something, a measure that ought to be addressed. So what they were dealing with was burglaries, and then what they were saying was that they were trying to equate black young people to burglaries, and it was just ridiculous, the kind of concepts that we were dealing with at that time. And then so firstly you had to change this concept of volume crime and get the police to recognize that they police by consent, and you cannot just measure on the basis of volume crime. You have to measure on impact. And once you start thinking about impact, then you start seeing that gun crime can have a significant impact on whole communities and whole neighborhoods and whole areas. So, they may be lower in volume, but the impact was huge. And that's why we set up Operation Trident, because, tackling the police on the over-policing of black people as criminals, which is what we were doing, and the under-policing of black communities as victims, wasn't necessarily getting them to understand that the fear that existed in communities over the issue of the disproportionate impact of gun crime, which was basically being run by a minority of, and I have to say largely men, who are using guns to protect a crack cocaine industry. So we were talking about men of violence rather than children of violence, men of violence who were using guns to protect the crack cocaine industry, aided and abetted by the police bringing in this so-called, so-called overseas criminals, criminal informants. There was, you can imagine the fear that existed. People just felt that the police were complicit in this level of criminality, that they basically could not find a way forward, and that they were living in fear on their estates. And then I remember I was working, long before I came to London, I was working in Reading at the time, and I was running a centre in the middle of Reading called the Central Reading Youth Provision. And that centre is known because we have on its wall all the deaths in police custody of black people on the wall, and the centre was right bang in the middle of Reading town centre, so you couldn't miss it. Nobody could miss this litany of deaths of black people black people at the hands of the police. And I knew then, taking on such a project, that I was already going to be a target. But one thing that happened that scared me no end when I was running this centre in the middle of Reading was I was there one evening and a limousine pulled up outside, and a gentleman came out and he said, I've come to take you to see, I won't tell you the person's name, to see this particular name. So it is a street name, because he just opened up a club.
Right.
And I'm thinking, well, how is this possible? This person just arrived from overseas, and I won't even tell you the country, but it's a Caribbean country. But this person had arrived from overseas, and he was suddenly opening up a nightclub, and he'd sent a limousine for me as to be a guest visitor. And I was literally petrified. And I managed to get out of that one, but the club was being opened right opposite Reading police station. I could not believe it. And that is how this was carrying on. And a few years later, I was in London and I worked with others, and we said enough is enough. We are not going to be terrified any longer. And it's to a real shame that, having built up Trident into a specialist operation, after the Lawrence inquiry, it made it impossible for the police to continue to neglect this part of this level of criminality. And after the Lawrence inquiry, produced so much, but after the Lawrence inquiry, we then got what we craved for, which was a dedicated police operation with the murder investigation unit placed within it, called Operation Trident, with dedicated officers, 400 officers at its height, with dedicated specialism, a transformation of the police, what they call the police support for families. The way that they were supporting families was completely transformed. The way in which gun crime was investigated, completely transformed. There was changes in law that outlawed, for example, the selling of imitation weapons in police stations, because as a volunteer, we could do what the police couldn't do, which is we could stand outside outside toy shops and, protest and hold banners up and say, why are you selling imitation weapons that could be so easily converted to the real thing? And that's real. All you needed was a bullet sent through the post, and then you could that was the last thing you needed from the conversion of that weapon into a live deadly thing. And basically, as a result, there was then a change in legislation, because we also, as an independent advisory group, we also went and met parliamentarians and said, this is what's happening, this is the picture, and everybody understood and got it. And there was, the gun law in Britain was already tight after Dunblane. However, there was still loopholes, and I can safely say that during my time in Operation Trident, we managed to close those loopholes. And of course, I ended up, being the chair of the Operation Trident Independent Advisory Group. There were many people on the Independent Advisory Group, at least more than half, who did not want it to be known that they were on that advisory group because of the fear that there was for reprisals and so on. And then there were some like myself who were, I guess, prepared to be out there and be named. And I took on the role of chairing the Independent Advisory Group, and that meant that we kept borough commanders to account at New Scotland Yard. They came round the table and we questioned and interrogated them about the correlation between gun crime, the ballistics, and weapons, and we kept focused on murder investigation. We weren't talking about all gun crime. We were focused on murder investigations and developing the specialisms around that, and that we created quite a lot of work, and it was all voluntary. And then right at that pinnacle time when Boris Johnson became mayor of the city, he then had a different take on what Trident could be used for, and he intervened negatively and decided that as Operation Blunt 1 and Operation Blunt 2 did not work. These were his policies on his manifesto pledge to end knife crime, which was an activity that was happening simultaneously with young people in the sort of in around that sort of period of time when he got elected. He said that he would end knife crime as a manifesto pledge. He brought in he followed on from Operation Blunt 1. He then transformed it into Operation Blunt 2, neither of which worked. And I understand, I mean, at the end of the day, they would never work because the police never built any relationship with young people. The success of Trident was his ability to build a distinct and unique relationship with the Black community as a brand. So people didn't say, the police are coming to support them, and the fact that they've lost a loved one, they were saying they want Operation Trident. It was built as a brand that was then recognised. But what Boris did was say, Operation Blunt 1 and 2, tackling knife crime and young people, didn't work, and he wanted to use something that was working. And he took, along with the commissioner at the time, they decided to take Operation Trident, turn it into their own thing, called it a gang unit. And I hate that term gangs because it means it's meaningless, and when applied to young people, called it into a gangs unit, and then said that they would chair Trident themselves. Of course it failed. And of course, in order to do that, they then locked me out and my colleagues out, and we were no longer welcome.
Another
at least for
example of
Trident.
something Johnson's touch turning to dust then.
Yeah, so it, and all of the commissioners that we have seen, they've all passed through Trident. They've all got their promotion on the backs of Trident. I know every single one of them. I've worked with every single one of them, and they are all have managed to go on and build their legacy and their careers off the work of Operation Trident. It's incredible to see that how the backs of Black people are continued to be trod on and stepped on, whilst change doesn't happen. And of course, what happens now is that it's not that gun crime has gone away, it's just that nobody's hearing about it.
No.
And that, we
That's
shone a light on it.
choice on the part of the media again, isn't it?
Well, it's no longer a focus. You would think that it was 2007 when young people started to be affected by gun crime, because up to then, largely young people were being protected from that prevalence of violence. This is the history of London, isn't it? There's always been gun crime, but young people have always largely been somewhat protected. But 2007 there was a step change, because the legislation, gun crime legislation, is tough, but there are still loopholes, and one of the loopholes is being able to hide your weapon with somebody more vulnerable, and young people started to be used by these men of violence to hold weapons, to hold guns, and hence the emergence of young people and guns. But the difficulty that there wasn't, because we had austerity creeping in as well, and the closure of youth clubs and after school provisions and so on. So there wasn't an equally protective safety net to protect young people. So you then started to see young people starting to go to bed with bulletproof vests and things like that, and guns being used, this concept of disrespect, even the move away from guns being used as something to protect crack cocaine, and having a significant correlation to crack cocaine started to emerge. And by 2010, 2011, something like 20% of gun-related murders and incidents that we were seeing in relation to Operation Trident was starting to emerge as young people being caught up in that. And of course, the rest is history since then. We've continued to see young people caught up in violent crimes. And this is what we have to see it as. And we have to correlate what's happening with young people with the relationship between the lack of resources, support, austerity, the closures of after-school provisions, the closures of issue-based youth work, the end of detached youth work. Many of your audience probably don't even know what detached youth work is, but essentially it's working on the streets with young people from wherever they're at, in their environments, on their terms, in their places of operating. And all you have as a worker is the shoes on your feet, and you go where young people are and you work with them till you get them to a positive outcome. And actually people are trained to do that area of work. It's called youth and community work. But again, that is a profession that has been decimated and cut back and almost made as though it's not a skill alongside being a social worker. It's a skill to take a young person from point A to point B because your intervention has transformed their lives for the better, not to their detriment. And so I also come from a school of thought that opposes the use of as much as I oppose criminal informants, I actually oppose the use of people who are so-called former gangs people, I hate that term, and former criminals, as though that is the only set of people that can connect with young people. Because once you make that connection, and I agree you have to make the connection, you must be able to take that person to a level which is to their betterment and not to their detriment, i.e. you must be able to transform that young person, both in terms of their emotional, cognitive self, as well as their personal development. And if you can't do that, what is the point of the connection? And that's the problem. And that's what the government has wasted a lot of money on. It's wasted a lot of money employing former criminals to be somehow youth workers. It doesn't work. You've got to go back to basics and give young people the real opportunities in terms of their educational, personal, cognitive development, and transform their lives so that it is to their betterment as opposed to their detriment. And there are many better resources out there that can do that. And unfortunately, the government have decimated the youth service and all the after school provision, the mental health interventions, the family work, and to the extent now that I don't know, and I touched back on violent crime and knife crime, really in particular. Just before this pandemic, knife crime was out of control, and what the government really needs to do is declare it an epidemic in order to ensure that the right level and type of resources is put at the problem. It's out of control is what I'm saying. And I speak as somebody who has dealt with the worst kind of violence ever in terms of gun crime. And I know that knife crime and other forms of violence as it relates to young people is out of control. It is not something that affects one neighborhood, one community, one ethnicity, or anything like that. It's a national problem, and it's in every community and every area, and that's why it's out of control.
Yeah, your depth of knowledge on this subject is absolutely mind-blowing. I think we could easily cover an hour just talking about this. But you, for most Labour members, if not the wider public, rose to prominence upon being elected to our National Executive Committee back in 2016. 92,000 votes was an incredible result, Claudia. You then became chair of the NEC Disputes Panel in 2018. Now, this year's NEC election has been a rather different affair. The left still did well. We got some excellent candidates elected, But what would your assessment be of this year's NEC elections?
Well, you know, I've not really been able to talk much about the Labour Party, the National Executive Committee, etc. But the only thing, look, I'm not really going to even talk about this year's election, except to say, you know, congratulations to those that were elected. It's clearly a different time to when I was elected in 2016, although it wasn't that long ago. I was elected in 2016 on a platform of the left to support Jeremy Corbyn as leader in an environment that was hostile to his leadership. And I thought it was important that we came together as the left, that we must recognize now that we have a left leader, a true left leader, and that this is something that we've been working at for all these years to have somebody that actually understood party democracy, understood the members' role in the party. You know, nothing. You know, at the end of the day, there's the Labour Party is nothing without its members, and it's somehow forgotten that. It's somehow lost touch with the concept that the party is nothing without its members. And here we have a left leader that was going to put members right at the centre of the Labour Party, right in terms of the leadership and decision making of the Labour Party. And therefore it was right that we came together as a left platform to really give Jeremy the support that he needed at that time, and that was the 2016 elections. And of course, you know, I think, you know, that was based on first past the post, as it were. Everything, you know, and obviously I got re-elected again in 2018 on it. Yeah, it's a 2-year election, but obviously since then we've got a different format of even election, a proportional representation format. And whatever people think about proportional representation, I don't think it necessarily brings about the kind of platform that you need to kind of take things forward. But you know, because I've seen proportional representation work in a manner that also, and I'm not saying that it applies to the Labour Party, but you know, of course, I spent some time as a key advisor to the first Mayor of London, and proportional representation exists there in terms of the Assembly. And if in a place like London, an Assembly can appoint a member of the National Front under proportional representation, then we know that we're in problems. And that's exactly what was able to happen in London back then with the election of a far right person to the Assembly under proportional representation. And I just can't tolerate that. I can't have that coming into my letterbox and frightening me, because I know what it was like growing up in a city in Leicester. I know what it was like growing up where you know, a far right political organisation, the National Front, gained traction in terms of politics. 1976, the National Front had 18% of the vote share on Leicester City Council. Imagine that. And what it means is that you feel that at that level of politics, but where it's really felt is on the ground in our communities. And of course, I felt it as a child, growing up in a city where a significant proportion of people voted for the National Front. And when I say significant, 18% to me is significant. They weren't in control, but it's 18%, and it has an impact on your life. I know I've steered away from the original question, but I would just really want to say that I make the correlation, not because I'm saying this is where the party is at. I'm just making the correlation because of proportional representation and its impact, in the sense that how I felt it as a child was I felt it not just verbally on going to and from school. I felt it physically, being beaten physically in the street simply because I am black, simply because I am black and female, simply because people wanted to call me names, and when they weren't happy with the names calling, they wanted to use their fists. And all I remember about going to school is constantly having to put my hand over my head to protect my head from the beats and the kicking that I constantly got just for being black. And that is what you get when you allow the far right to gain any traction in under proportional representation. So I make that correlation partly because I don't really want to go into depth about the party and the latest National Executive Committee, but I will say that the party's come, the party's always been divided left and right to some extent. The party's come a long way from my days of when I first tried to join the party. I was told it was full. I was a young person. I was told it was full. And, obviously I was told it was full because they didn't want the likes of me to join the party. Whether that's, I don't think that was necessarily about my colour. I think it was more about my politics. And it's a left politics, and I grew into that left politics because of my experiences. And I remember being called a gadfly. I had to look up what's a gadfly. I mean, basically an irritant, and an irritant like me is not somebody that you want in the party. I don't think I'm particularly. I know all these names that we get called for being of the left. On the left, we're simply on the left. We're not. We're not. We get called all these sorts of names, and it's not where I am really in terms of what people call me, and certainly my community would think I'm quite soft rather than quite hard. Hard left, as it were. They want to say.
They do like that word hard, don't they? Hard left. There
was hard left, and really, what does this mean? Because my community themselves would say I'm quite soft. They would regard, because when you take on a role like chair in Operation Trident, people want you to actually not really do that. They want you to really challenge the police, and I was challenging the police, but not in the way that some people wanted me to necessarily. But and therefore you kind of like, you're not seen as hard anything. You're seen as well, in some respects you're seen as a mediocre person as such. All I'm saying is that being on the left, I can't see anything wrong with wanting to fight for the end of poverty, wanting to fight for better workers' rights, wanting to fight for proper wages, wanting to ensure that the most vulnerable are protected, wanting to ensure that the most vulnerable have a vote. Jeremy Corbyn wanted to ensure that the unemployed had a vote. He wanted to ensure that Black young people weren't written off. And I remember those days when as a Labour Party activist, you were told, you're given a clipboard and you're told which doors to knock on. And you don't knock on doors that the party has written off. And they write those people off because they're unemployed or they're from the Black community and they're not going to vote. And the notion that people don't vote, you've got to give people a reason to vote. It's not that people don't vote, and it's not that the Black community generally doesn't vote. It's that they need to have a reason and a passion for voting, i.e. that something different is going to happen, some change is going to happen for them. Yeah. And Jeremy's politics was, we're not going to write people off, we're not going to sit on our hands, when it comes to welfare rights and welfare benefits, and that's what the party did when Jeremy was just before Jeremy was elected. The party sat on its hands when it came to the welfare rights votes, as though certain people didn't matter. Of course, they must matter, and this is the change that was needed at the time. And that's why it was important. That's why I stepped forward and said, that I'm going to stand for the National Executive Committee at that time. It was such a critical and important change that was needed, that the first year of Jeremy's leadership, it was embarrassing as a person, as anybody, any Labour member must have been embarrassed when they watched time after time that the TV, and they saw Jeremy being laughed at, not from the opposition, not from the opposite bench, but laughed at behind his back from his own side. I mean, it was so visible to us all. And then to see the National Executive Committee at that time, when Jeremy first got elected, how difficult he had being leader and getting the support that he needed. So he didn't have the support at the NEC, no support at the Parliamentary Labour Party, and therefore what was needed was, if you're going to run something, you've got to have the people that are on that board have got to support you. Which chief executive or leader is running an organisation and its board doesn't respect them? I mean, something had to give, something had to change. I stepped in to offer a sense of support, and in up until that point in time, I'd say that the party tolerated me, but once I stepped into the throes of the NEC, I felt like, when I say the party, I'm talking about the kind of like the way the party was operating, generally speaking, on both sides, left and right. I was generally seen to be tolerated by the right. Once I became on the NEC, I became a hate figure, and I never felt that hate before. The last time I felt that hate was when I was an advisor to the first Mayor of London, because the first Mayor of London decided to become an independent. Well, not decided, but the party machinery at that time decided that they weren't going to have him as the Labour candidate for mayor. And of course, that was an unfair decision at that time. He was up against Frank Dobson. And if you remember, many people won't remember this, but obviously, he won that nomination fair and square, and then it was the leadership of the party took that away. So at that point in time, it meant that the Labour Assembly that was in play saw the first Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, as the enemy, I guess, and then anybody who was an advisor to him were equally the enemy. So I had plenty of daggers. I felt them in my back. They were aimed at Ken himself back in 2000. And this was before we even moved to City Hall. This was when we were down at Marsham Street, at the old building there. But the daggers were coming, and mainly not from the Tories necessarily, but from our own side in terms of the Labour Assembly at that time. And as an advisor, one of 12 advisors at that time, we felt that the daggers sharp and hard. So goodness knows how many daggers Ken had to take out himself. But back then, of course, there were many issues to fight for London, including, the PPP and all of that jazz, and the privatisation.
I was going to come on to ask you, actually. I mean, knowing that you were was it the culture and tourism advisor to Ken Livingstone. So what have been your proudest achievements during your time there?
I smile simply because, I mean, look, that administration transformed London into what we know today. The congestion charge, massive. Introduction to end and tackle, to try to tackle climate change as it was known then, and obviously the climate emergency that we face now, but nonetheless could have been far worse had we not, or had Ken not made that decision to bring in the congestion charge, which was a powerful thing to do at the time to kind of end to put the focus right on cars as being significant polluters, and significant contributors to carbon emissions, and to make that absolutely clear, and to actually create an office to tackle climate change was a very important thing to have in a mayoralty, and that the fact that was consistently reduced into nothing by the time when Boris Johnson came on board, that he abandoned the office, a climate change office. It was irresponsible, to say the least. And obviously what followed suit, many local authorities also abandoned their climate change roles, and this again was quite damning. But that's one of the biggest things, and then of course the battle to the kind of ensuring that young people had free travel for the under 18s, making museums free and open, enabling the digital formation of Oyster cards and that sort of thing, transforming those things, buses, making them more accessible and available. There was a huge amount that was achieved under that mayoralty that I think that really hasn't been replicated. It was a socialist agenda. We brought in, the politics was socialist mayor, delivering a socialist agenda, the sort of thing that any Labour person should be proud of, but the sort of thing that the city as a whole was proud of. It was a complete transformation right across the board. And for my part, the bit I smile about is in terms of, the one big thing that I had to tackle was Trafalgar Square. Well, two public squares really. I had to try and transform these Trafalgar Squares. The mayor in the sort of the kind of legislation only has two public places. One is Trafalgar Square and sort of Parliament Square. And Trafalgar Square was full of pigeons.
Yeah.
And so every time anybody saw me, I was on TV talking about pigeons. It's not a subject that I wanted to talk about, as you can imagine. And even at one point, I won't say which channel it was, which news report it was, but they even forgot my name and just called me the Pigeon Lady. So, or the Pigeon Advisor or something like that. But it was a ludicrous thing. But of course, before we could get to a place where we could restore Parliament Square to that place where we were able to have our speaking engagements again. And, Parliament Square has a long history, the Miners' March and all of that, but it had lost some of its glory days in the intervening years that Westminster City Council, I think it was, that was in control of it at the time. But with the mayoralty came the positioning of Trafalgar Square and Parliament Square back to be run by the city, by the mayor, and therefore it meant that Parliament Square and Trafalgar Square, where many of the marches and demonstrations had happened in the past, could be restored to those same marches, demonstrations, public speaking. But there had to be a balance with basically enabling the pigeons to find a new home, and to allow people to be able to speak and have marches and demonstrations in the way that there was before. One of the big things that that emerged to celebrate that achievement was the fact that I organised the South Africa Freedom Day concert, which turned into quite a sort of an international affair that was televised across the world, with Mandela appearing as well. So that was quite something to see at that time, but it meant also that I was able to organise the removal of vehicles and cars for that, to enable 20,000 people to come to South Africa Freedom Day, the 10th anniversary, the sort of South African Freedom Day celebrations, and that meant for 20,000 people to be able to be there, we had to remove all of the vehicles and cars and access, and that was pretty good to be able to do and achieve that. And people remember the fourth plinth, which again happened under my time, and the most significant thing I think that happened during my time as well was the first meeting of the Olympics, that we now know for the 2012 Olympics. The first person that the British Olympic Committee came to see was me as the mayor's advisor, simply because Ken at that time was heavily and deeply involved with dealing with the PPP, which was very important. And so the British Olympic Committee held their first meeting with me, and I was able to clearly put across Ken's principal position, which was that if the Olympics are going to happen in London, that they would happen in the east of London, not because Ken had a particular passion for Olympics at that time, because his greatest sport, if he was to do any sports at all, was bowls. But so basically his message was that it was to happen in the east of London because he wanted to see the regeneration of East London. He wanted to see the jobs, the investment, and all of that would flow. And if we, that is what the legacy of the Olympics 2012 would be for him, at least, and for the city. And he achieved a great thing in that regard.
Fantastic. Well, it would be remiss of me to not bring the Tories into this story somewhere, because let's say, well, what's a wasted opportunity if we don't say something about them. We've seen Rishi Sunak imply this week that we've got to pay for his government's incompetent handling of the COVID crisis, locking down too late, withdrawing support to furloughed workers too late, exacerbating an unemployment crisis at the same time, screwing up procurements, and of course, you spoke earlier in the week on our channel here about the cronyism and the deals with mates that have failed to deliver despite exorbitant spending on them, the Dido Hardings of this sorry tale. We've had the BBC's Laura Koonsberg report on this as the nation's credit card or the nation's mortgage is being maxed out, in effect supporting Sunak's plans to, again, freeze public sector workers' pay or cut universal credit. And with her misleading impression of how the economy works, Sunak might not want to call it austerity, but it's austerity we're faced with again, isn't it? And again, the public are being misinformed by mainstream media sources. These media people, they're not stupid. They know what they're doing. So what can we on the left do to challenge such appalling misinformation and bias from mainstream media?
We've got to do what in effect your program here is doing, which is provide an alternative media and medium. That's one thing. I mean, it's important. I mean, it's of course important to put those arguments across in the mainstream media, but actually people's capacity for news, for receiving information is diverse and becoming diverser by the day. And the more that we can create an alternative medium, like what this medium is doing, the better. And that's why I applaud left mediums, because it's really important that we get an alternative perspective presented, because the BBC, you know, all of those mainstream forms are not really presenting a balanced narrative, and you know, what the government is doing to our communities is nothing short of shameful. You know, to clap on one hand, you know, the heroic workers in our health and care and social care system, and then deliver pay cuts, real-term pay cuts. And then the media pundits that they employ, the powers that be they employ, that do not point this out, that this is real-term pay cuts. This is not paying people and protecting the lowest paid workers. And this is what this government's about. And therefore, we've got to continue to expose this every single time. And that means also that those people that are called sometimes they do the newspaper reviews, and they sometimes try and put a left and a right person up to do the reviews. And you know that this isn't, in reality, they haven't put up any left person to do these reviews. And you therefore are not getting an alternative perspective. You're getting much of the same. And that obviously
goes to the papers they're even reviewing, actually, because there's never any left-wing paper there. There's never,
I mean, no, absolutely. They're not sort of reviewing the Morning Star or any left paper in that regard. I think the nearest we got to the Morning Star being reviewed was on Jeremy's first. The nearest we got to the Morning Star reviewed was in 2017, when the polls went. When then the poll came out that Labour was, you know, it was neck and neck sort of thing. And then all of a sudden there was a Morning Star on the review list, and it was, the Morning Star became suddenly people's reading in their reading schedule of reading journals. So that's the nearest we came. But the reality is that there are three nexus of power in my view, and that is politics, corporate sector, and the media. We cannot underestimate those three nexuses of power, and we cannot underestimate the collaboration, the powerful collaboration they have when worked together, and it is because of those three nexuses of power, for example, why I believe the exploitation of workers exists. It is not possible for billionaires in politics. You know, Boris Johnson's cabinet is made up of billionaires, very wealthy people. It's not possible for them to understand the plight of the working class. It's not possible for them to even care about the plight, the plight of workers and the worker exploitation that is going on. It is possible, however, for them to enable the corporate sector to continue to have their shares grow even in a pandemic, to have their shares grow and get wealthier even in a crisis, to have their shares grow and get wealthier even when they commission their own report that exposes them, as in the case of Boohoo, and their shares continue to go up and nothing happens and nothing changes. Meanwhile, workers continue to be exploited, workers continue to be on poverty pay, and workers continue to be dealt a hard blow. Why? Because at the same time, the media is saying that these workers deserve it. Is trying to say that because of their ethnicity, they deserve it. It's trying to say that somehow these people are slaves brought in from elsewhere. All false narratives, completely false. And yet the media are allowed to get away with notions of modern day slavery. as though people have been brought in on some kind of boat and then taking cash in hand. Nothing, it could be nothing of the sort. It's much further from the truth. We are talking about workers that have worked in this industry since 1992. We're talking about a city that is extremely diverse, that people have been here since my parents' generation and before. We're not talking about workers that are, taking cash in hand. We're talking about people that receive a pay slip that gives them 20 hours working week when they've worked 55 hours. We're talking about exploitation of workers. We're talking about a workforce that is diverse. The working class is truly diverse because it's reflected here in Leicester's garment industry. For us to be able to recognise that workers, whether they're in Leicester, Manchester, London, or overseas in Bangladesh or Turkey, they're workers nonetheless. They're part of the working class. They're parts of a system which does not recognise even unions. Not a single garment factory that we speak of in Leicester recognises a union. The greatest thing to protect workers in the workplace is for there to be union recognition so that they can have a voice. And yet this government knows this, and it continues to try to demonize and put down trade unions with their appalling legislation that doesn't give a scope for unions to be in our workplaces and actually advocate rights for individuals that are exploited. And what obviously all of that needs to change, that we've got collective ability to bargain, to collective rights to be able to challenge the workplace and challenge those exploitative bosses, and then ability to challenge the brands so that they are not able to continue to drive profit off the back of workers' rights. It is true, billionaires exist because of the exploitation of the working class. It's absolutely true.
No one can earn it. They can only gain it off the backs of others. Claudia Webbe, equalities activist, racial equalities activist, trade union activist, political advisor, pigeon lady. Thank you so much for supporting us on Left Wing Media TV tonight, supporting alternative media. It's been a genuine pleasure to talk to you. I hope you'll come back for another chat in the near future. Next week, I will be joined by the sadly now former Labour MP for Crewe and Nantwich, the fabulous Laura Smith. So make sure you're back with us for that. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.